Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Piano Talk. I'm Brian Ganz, musician in residence at St. Mary's College of Maryland. In my Piano Talk series, I take lovers of classical music behind the scenes of a great work and then play it for them. Today's masterpiece is a short mazurka of Frédéric Chopin, the Mazurka in A-flat major from Opus 41. In some editions, it's listed as Opus 41 number 4, but according to the most recent scholarship, it really should be Opus 41 number 3. But that's a long story, best left for another day. A mazurka is a Polish dance that originated in the Mazovia region of Poland, outside of Warsaw. Chopin grew up in Warsaw, but spent some wonderful time in the summer in his middle teenage years in Mazovia, where he first became acquainted with Polish folk music. Later, Chopin would leave his homeland of Poland when he was just 20 years old, never to return. But I like to say that he returned every time he composed a mazurka, and he wrote more mazurkas than he did any other genre. In fact, the number of mazurkas he composed is more than double his next most plentiful genre, the Etude. So writing mazurkas must have been profoundly satisfying to him, and he invested a tremendous amount of creativity and originality in them, as well as a deep love for his homeland. They are among his most soulful works. I also like to say that they are Chopin's creative laboratory, where he takes more risks and conducts more experiments than he does in any other genre. So when you hear or play a mazurka, always look between the lines for interesting experiments. And that's what we'll do with today's Piano Talk. The Mazurka in A-flat major, Opus 41 number 3, begins by somewhat impersonating a waltz. Waltzes are smoother dances rhythmically. They often feature relatively long strings of eighth notes without any sharp rhythmic gestures. Mazurkas, by contrast, are characterized by dotted rhythms, usually heard on the first beat of the measure, yum-pa-dum-pa, yum-pa-da. That dotted rhythm represents the hop in the actual dance itself. Here's a typical mazurka rhythm from one of Chopin's earliest mazurkas, Opus 7, number 1. Our mazurka today begins with a much gentler theme, rhythmically speaking. We only hear subtle dotted rhythms in the 6th and 8th measures of that opening theme. I'll play it for you again. And we could be forgiven for thinking we are listening to a waltz. Now that's very lovely, but there are no experiments yet. Notice that the left hand so far is playing in a very typical waltz manner, with bass notes on the downbeat and then chords on beats 2 and 3 in pa-pa fashion. But after the first series of phrases, things start to get really interesting, with a gorgeous passage written in 4-part harmony, almost like a chorale, which we don't expect to see in a dance by Chopin. So here's our first experiment. Can that work in a mazurka? So I'll begin by finishing the previous series of phrases, and you'll recognize the measures that you hear, and I'll move directly into the chorale. And for now, we'll just enjoy its exquisite beauty, and we'll drill a little deeper in a moment. We can still hear the dotted rhythms, now even a bit more plentifully, and they remind us that we're listening to a mazurka. But it's the four-part writing that really animates this passage and makes it, for my ears at least, incredibly beautiful. Some of you may have seen the letters S-A-T-B and wondered what they stood for. Soprano. Here's the soprano part. And the A stands for alto. Here's the alto part. T stands for tenor. Not as melodic as the other two. And B stands for bass. Let's hear all four voices together one more time. Now, often in four-part writing, we hear what we call suspensions. A suspension is a note that is consonant when it's played, but then it's held or suspended. And as the notes around it change, the one we're holding or suspending becomes dissonant and yearns for resolution. So let's dig deeper into that concept and see how it plays out in this beautiful passage. So I finished the previous phrase like this. And notice that I finished with this note. And at that moment, it's consonant, which is just to say that it is part of the surrounding harmony. It sounds resolved or at rest. But now I hold that note, that E flat. Notice that the chord around it changes. And that E flat that I'm holding goes from being consonant to being dissonant. And if it's dissonant, it yearns for resolution. And that moment of yearning for resolution is incredibly beautiful to me, to my ears at least, and I hope also to your ears. And there's the resolution. Now that's happening there in the alto voice. And it's followed immediately by a similar suspension in the soprano voice. when I play the G there, it's part of this chord and it's very harmonious with that chord. But that chord is resolved, but the G is not. It's suspended and then resolved. There's that beautiful moment again of yearning and resolution. Pianists have to be extra careful to hold suspensions so that the listener can hear them in all of their dissonant beauty. It can be an excellent exercise, by the way, to train the ear to hear these suspensions well by replaying them rather than just holding them as they become suspensions. That is, when they move from consonance to dissonance. So let's listen to what that exercise sounds like. Could you hear that I was replaying the suspensions rather than just holding them? Listen one more time. Now let's see if that exercise helped you to hear more vividly the dissonance when I just hold the suspension rather than replaying it. I don't know about you, but I would call that a very successful experiment indeed. Chopin composes in rich, four-part texture, complete with gorgeous suspensions, while retaining the flavor of a mazurka. Nice. So that leads to an extension of the four-part passage in which Chopin adds a fifth part and turns the bottom two parts into what we call drone fifths. That's the interval of a fifth played over and over. It's a perfect fifth. And they're like the drone notes of an instrument such as a bagpipe. And in fact, there is a Polish folk instrument like a bagpipe, and it's called a Etude. We often hear drone fifths, sometimes called bourdon fifths, in Chopin's mazurkas, and he was almost certainly imitating the sound of a Etude. Listen to that passage. That entire passage was anchored with that perfect fifth. Sometimes down here. Now that brings us to Chopin's next experiment. What would a mazurka theme sound like if certain portions of it were surgically removed? Would it work? Or would it sound, to use an inelegant metaphor, sort of moth-eaten? So listen to what happens next. We're in a new key, C major instead of A flat major. Did that work for your ears? Did it sound complete in itself? Did it sound like a lovely tune that maybe rings a pleasant bell? Or did it sound a little off, like something important is missing? There's no right answer. And we can assume that some experiments that Chopin performs in the Mazurkas may not be so successful. By now you're guessing that Chopin is doing something a little sneaky here, some sleight of ear, if you will, in that passage. Do you know that I played this Mazurka for many, many years before I really noticed what it is he's doing? He's returning to the opening theme, but leaving some notes out. Let me show you. Here are the first two bars of the opening theme in A flat major. Now I'll transpose that to C major. Now I'll just chop off a few notes, and here's what I get. That's what Chopin wrote. So here's a confession. I only noticed that very recently. So we could say Chopin is sort of beginning to remind us of home, as if maybe he's showing us half of a photo of our home and saying, do you recognize this? We're the ones who have to figure out what's going on. He's just giving us hints and suggestions. But we're still in the wrong key. We're still in C major, and somehow we have to get back to A flat major. And now Chopin does something truly wonderful. He sets the right hand alone in search of our home key. Go, he seems to say. Go find home. So off it goes. Still in C major. Still all in C major. Now he takes this note, that's D, as part of C major, and he turns it into D flat. Partway there. Now he takes this note, which is B, still part of C major, and he turns it into B flat, part of A flat major. And now we're home. Let's listen to the whole passage with no interruption. Marvelous. Now, most of what remains is a repetition of what came earlier, but Chopin has one more experiment up his sleeve, and it's his boldest yet. What would happen if we end the piece in the middle of a phrase? Chopin does it so smoothly that if you're unaware of phrase structure as you listen, you might not even notice what he's doing. And really, how many of us are aware of phrase structure as we listen? So you wouldn't know what he's doing, but you would sense how curious the ending is, how beguilingly beautiful, even hauntingly beautiful. So what I'd like to do first is to play it for you as Chopin did not compose it, with 4 complete phrases. So I've made up a little ending, and this will be an example of what the piece might sound like in the hands of a less imaginative composer. So here are the final 4 phrases in my version. my debut as a composer. All right, maybe it was pretty, but it certainly wasn't bold. Now remember, in Chopin's version, he ends in the middle of a phrase with both asymmetry and incompletion. So his experiment is, can that work? Listen and see what you think. I'm sure you noticed that that was the chorale theme he chose to end the Mazurka with. I don't know about you, but I find that not only incredibly beautiful, but also enchanting. Sort of like a wonderful dream that we can't quite remember or grasp hold of. And yet it leaves us feeling enchanted. All right, I think that's enough exploration. And now I will put aside the music and put on a jacket and play through this wonderful gem in its entirety. Hope you enjoy. Well, I hope you very much enjoyed today's piano talk, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Stay safe, and all best wishes.